The Boeing 737 MAX was 37 minutes out of Denver when Captain Rick Morrison collapsed over the yoke. First Officer Janet Walsh had exactly 14 seconds to process what was happening before the aircraft pitched into a shallow dive, passenger oxygen masks deploying like yellow confetti across the cabin. The screaming started immediately, that primal, terrified sound that cuts through everything else. But in seat 7C, Kestrel Vance wasn't screaming. She was calculating. The mathematical precision of her mind kicked in automatically. Descent rate, altitude loss, recovery window. Numbers had always been her sanctuary, even when everything else fell apart, especially then. The woman beside her clutched a rosary, whispering prayers in rapid Spanish, while the businessman across the aisle filmed everything with his phone, his hands shaking so violently the footage would be useless. But Kestrel's hands were steady. They always had been. Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Walsh speaking. The voice over the intercom carried the forced calm of someone fighting panic. We're experiencing a medical emergency with our captain. If there are any pilots aboard, please identify yourselves to the flight attendants immediately. Kestrel closed her eyes for 3 seconds, a habit from her Air Force days, a moment to center herself before the chaos. She could smell the recycled air, hear the hydraulic whine of the aircraft systems adjusting to compensate for the pilot's absence. Through the small window, she saw the Rocky Mountains spreading below like a crumpled map, beautiful and unforgiving. The same mountains she'd flown over hundreds of times in her F-16, back when she wore the uniform and people called her by her call sign, Phoenix. That name felt like a lifetime ago now. These days, she was just another passenger in civilian clothes, another face in the crowd flying home to Seattle after visiting her mother's grave. The Medal of Honor tucked away in her carry-on bag felt heavy, though she knew it weighed the same as it always had. Some burdens don't get lighter with time. The flight attendant appeared beside her row, panic evident despite her professional smile. "Ma'am, excuse me, but did you raise your hand? Are you a pilot?" 347 souls aboard this aircraft. Kestrel knew that number because she'd made it her business to know, another old habit. She'd learned long ago that when you're responsible for lives, you count them all. Every single one matters. "Yes," she said quietly, unbuckling her seatbelt. "I can fly." What she didn't say was that she'd once been the youngest woman ever selected for the Air Force's elite test pilot program. That she'd survived 3 combat tours and countless missions that never made the headlines. That her call sign came from the way she'd risen from the ashes of every impossible situation they'd thrown at her. She simply stood up and followed the flight attendant toward the cockpit, where First Officer Walsh was fighting to keep them all alive. The aircraft shuddered slightly as they adjusted course, and Kestrel felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like an old flight suit. Some things you never really take off. Through the narrow aisle, she could see the cockpit door standing open, the captain's motionless form slumped in his seat. Walsh was talking rapidly into her headset, sweat visible on her forehead even from this distance. The autopilot was engaged, but automation could only do so much. They needed human judgment, human instinct. They needed a pilot. Kestrel stepped into the cockpit and immediately felt the shift in atmosphere. This was different from her F-16, bigger, more complex in some ways, simpler in others. But the fundamental truth remained the same: metal and fuel and physics, held together by the thin thread of human skill. "Thank God," Walsh breathed, glancing over her shoulder. "Are you current on the MAX?" "No," Kestrel admitted, sliding into the captain's seat after the flight attendants had carefully moved the unconscious man. "But I've got time in the NG series, and I'm a quick study." She ran her hands over the controls, feeling the familiar texture of switches and displays. The muscle memory was still there, buried under 5 years of civilian life, but intact. Her fingers found the radio control instinctively. "Denver Center, United 1847, declaring emergency." Captain is incapacitated. Backup pilot assuming control. The response came immediately, crisp and professional. United 1847, Denver Center. We copy emergency declared. State intentions and pilot qualifications. Kestrel hesitated for just a moment. How do you explain that you used to be the best at something you walked away from? That you left the sky because the weight of perfection had finally become too much to bear? Denver Center. Backup pilot is former military, fighter qualified. Requesting vectors to nearest suitable airport and emergency equipment standing by. United 1847, understand military pilot. Nearest suitable is Colorado Springs, bearing 180, distance 95 miles. Airport is alerting emergency services. Walsh looked at her with undisguised relief. Military fighter pilot, thank God. What did you fly? F-16, Kestrel replied, her hands already moving across the instrument panel, checking system status. Block 50, about 3,000 hours. She didn't mention the medals, the commendations, the classified missions. She didn't mention that she'd been considered one of the finest pilots of her generation before she'd abruptly resigned her commission and disappeared into civilian life. Some stories were too complicated for emergency situations. The aircraft felt different under her control, heavier, more deliberate than the nimble fighter jet she was used to. But the principles were the same. Respect the machine, trust your training, and never let fear make your decisions. Below them, the landscape rolled past in autumn colors, gold and rust spreading across the Colorado Plateau like a vast canvas. It was beautiful, but Kestrel couldn't afford to appreciate beauty right now. She had 347 souls to deliver safely to the ground, including her own. United 1847, Denver Center. Advise pilot's experience level with commercial aircraft. Walsh gave her a questioning look, and Kestrel keyed the microphone again. Denver Center. Pilot has significant military flight time but limited commercial experience. Will require guidance for approach and landing procedures specific to this aircraft type. There was a pause. Then, United 1847 understood. We're coordinating with United Maintenance to provide technical support. Stand by for approach briefing. Kestrel adjusted her seat, feeling the weight of 300 pairs of eyes behind her, though the cockpit door remained closed. She thought about her mother's funeral 3 days ago, how the honor guard had folded the flag with such precision, how the silence had stretched between the mountains like a held breath. Her mother had never understood why she'd left the Air Force. You were born to fly, she'd said during their last conversation. It's who you are. Maybe it was, maybe it still was. The radio crackled with vectors and weather updates, and Kestrel felt herself slipping back into the rhythm of controlled flight. Her call sign might have been buried with her military career, but the skills remained. The instincts were still sharp. She was Phoenix again, whether she wanted to be or not. And 347 people were counting on her to remember exactly what that meant. The approach to Colorado Springs would be challenging. Winds gusting to 35 knots, visibility reduced by blowing snow. But Kestrel had landed F-16s in worse conditions, in places where the margin for error was measured in inches rather than feet. This was just another mission, another chance to prove that some things don't break, they just bend until they find their strength again. Walsh began reading through the emergency checklist, her voice steady now that she had support. Together, they would bring this bird home. Together, they would prove that sometimes the sky sends exactly who you need, exactly when you need them. Even if she's sitting in 7C, trying to forget she was ever meant to fly. The mountains rose ahead of them like ancient guardians, and Kestrel banked the aircraft toward Colorado Springs, toward the runway that would either validate every choice she'd ever made or demand explanations she wasn't sure she could give. Either way, she was committed now. The bird was hers to fly, and she intended to fly it home. The radio crackled with approach control, and Kestrel Vance, Phoenix, prepared to remember exactly what it felt like to save lives at 30,000 feet. Colorado Springs Tower came online with vectors and wind conditions, their voices professional but underlaid with tension. Emergency vehicles were positioning on the runway, their red and blue lights creating a constellation of readiness against the approaching dusk. Kestrel could picture it perfectly: the fire trucks, the ambulances, the incident commanders coordinating response protocols. She'd seen it all before from both sides. United 1847, Colorado Springs approach. Turn right heading 160, descend and maintain 8,000. Weather current. Winds 320 at 28, gusting 35, visibility 3 miles in blowing snow. Walsh winced at the wind report. That's going to be interesting in a max. Kestrel was already mentally calculating the approach parameters: crosswind limits, gust factors, the increased landing distance they'd need. The Max was heavier than her F-16, less responsive, but the physics remained constant. Energy management, angle of attack, the delicate dance between thrust and drag. "We'll be fine," she said, adjusting the descent rate with subtle pressure on the yoke. "I've landed in worse." Behind them, she could hear the flight attendants making their announcements, preparing the cabin for emergency landing procedures. The professional calm in their voices reminded her of mission briefings, that same practiced composure masking deeper currents of concern. United 1847. Be advised, we have reports of moderate turbulence on final approach due to terrain effects. Copy approach, we're configured for rough air. Kestrel's hands moved instinctively to the engine controls, adjusting power settings to maintain stable airspeed despite the gusting winds. The aircraft bucked slightly as they encountered the first thermal currents bouncing off the mountainous terrain. Walsh gripped her armrests. "Jesus, is it always this rough?" "Mountain flying," Kestrel explained, her voice calm despite the aircraft's motion. "Air gets squeezed between the peaks, creates standing waves, like rapids in a river but vertical." She'd learned to read mountain air during her early days as a lieutenant, flying training missions out of Peterson Air Force Base. The same base they were approaching now, actually, a fact that felt like the universe arranging its own form of poetry. She'd taken off from these runways hundreds of times, usually in single-seat fighters that responded to her thoughts as much as her hands. This was different, heavier, more complex, filled with civilians who'd never signed up for military-grade turbulence. But the principle remained: trust your instruments, fly the aircraft, don't let conditions dictate your actions. United 1847, contact Colorado Springs Tower 118.4. Good luck. Tower 118.4, United 1847. Thank you, approach. The frequency change felt like crossing a threshold. Tower control meant they were in the landing phase now, committed to bringing this story to its conclusion on runway 35L. United 1847, Colorado Springs Tower. Wind 320 at 30, gusting 38. Runway 35L, cleared to land. Emergency equipment is standing by. Walsh read through the final landing checklist while Kestrel configured the aircraft for approach. Flaps, gear, engine settings, each adjustment bringing them closer to the moment when skill would either prove sufficient or reveal its limits. The runway lights appeared through the blowing snow like a golden pathway, perfectly aligned despite the crosswind trying to push them eastward. Kestrel applied opposite rudder, the aircraft crabbing slightly to maintain course, while the wind tried to write its own story. "Looking good," Walsh breathed, monitoring their approach speed and descent rate. At 500 feet, the GPWS called out altitude warnings while Kestrel fought the gusting crosswind. The aircraft wanted to weathervane into the wind, but she held it steady with firm control inputs that felt familiar despite the years away from military flying. At 100 feet, she could see individual emergency vehicles lined along the runway, their crews ready for whatever this landing might bring. At 50 feet, she began the flare, pulling power and raising the nose as the runway rose to meet them. The main landing gear touched down firmly but smoothly, the aircraft's weight settling onto the runway with a solid thump that drew applause from the cabin behind them. Kestrel deployed the thrust reversers and applied brakes, feeling the familiar sensation of controlled deceleration. "Beautiful landing," Walsh said, genuine admiration in her voice. Kestrel didn't respond immediately. She was too busy running through post-landing procedures, ensuring all systems were secured and the aircraft was truly safe. Only when they'd cleared the active runway and stopped at the gate did she finally allow herself to breathe. 347 souls, all safely on the ground. Behind them, she could hear passengers beginning to move, the nervous energy of survival expressing itself in chatter and the rustle of personal belongings being gathered. Soon, there would be questions, interviews, paperwork, the usual aftermath of emergency situations. But for now, there was just the quiet satisfaction of a mission completed successfully. Walsh was looking at her with curiosity and respect. "Phoenix," she said quietly. "That was your call sign, wasn't it? I heard you almost say it on the radio." Kestrel nodded. She'd caught herself doing exactly that, reverting to old habits under pressure. "Why did you leave?" Walsh asked. "If you don't mind me asking, pilots like you don't usually just walk away from military flying." It was a fair question, one that deserved more than a simple answer. But the full story was complicated, woven through with loss and guilt, and the slow realization that perfection could become its own form of prison. "Sometimes," Kestrel said finally, "you have to lose your wings to remember why you needed them in the first place." She unbuckled her harness and stood up, preparing to face whatever came next. The emergency vehicles were pulling back now, their crews securing equipment and filing their reports. Another successful rescue, another story that would fade into bureaucratic memory. But Kestrel knew that some stories don't really end when the emergency is over. Sometimes they're just beginning. As she walked toward the cabin door, she could feel the weight of 300 grateful stares, hear the murmur of voices saying "thank you" in multiple languages. A little girl in row 12 was crying, not from fear anymore, but from relief. Her mother held her close, whispering reassurances in French. An elderly man in row 8 caught her eye and nodded solemnly. He was wearing a Veterans Administration cap, and his expression carried the recognition of one warrior acknowledging another. No words were needed. The flight attendants were processing passengers through the jet bridge now, each person's exit representing another life delivered safely to the ground. Kestrel found herself counting again, old habit, ensuring that her passenger manifest matched reality. 347 out, 347 safe. A young businessman stopped beside her seat. "Thank you," he said simply. "My wife is having our first baby next month. I almost didn't make it home." "Congratulations," Kestrel replied, "on both counts." He smiled and moved on, and she realized that was what she'd been missing in civilian life. The direct connection between skill and consequence, between training and lives saved. The absolute clarity of purpose that only came when everything was on the line. The last passenger off was an Air Force sergeant in dress blues, traveling for what looked like official business. He paused at the cockpit door and saluted, a brief, crisp movement that acknowledged her service without making a show of it. "Thank you, ma'am. Outstanding job." She returned the salute instinctively, muscle memory overriding 5 years of civilian habits. "Semper Fi, Sergeant." "Aim high, Colonel." He'd recognized her rank somehow, maybe something in her bearing, or the way she'd handled the emergency. Military people had an instinct for identifying their own, even across service branches and time. When the aircraft was finally empty, Walsh joined her at the gate. "The company wants to debrief you tomorrow, and there'll probably be media interest." Kestrel nodded. She'd expected as much. Emergency landings by civilian pilots always drew attention, especially when the backup pilot turned out to have an interesting background. "Will you do it? The interviews, I mean." It was a good question. The old Kestrel would have declined, would have faded back into civilian anonymity as quickly as possible. Privacy had become precious to her, a sanctuary from the demands of perfection that military life had imposed. But standing here in Colorado Springs, the same base where she'd learned to fly fighters, where she'd first heard her call sign, where she'd discovered what it meant to be responsible for something larger than herself, she felt something shifting inside her chest. A recognition, maybe, or a remembering. "Yes," she heard herself say, "I think I will." Because maybe Walsh was right. Maybe some stories needed to be told, not for the glory or the recognition, but for the reminder they offered. That skill has purpose. That training matters. That sometimes the right person really is sitting in 7C when the world needs saving. The snow was still falling outside the terminal windows, creating a soft hush over the airfield. Somewhere out there, other aircraft were taking off and landing, their pilots navigating weather and darkness with the same blend of technology and instinct that had brought her home safely tonight. The sky was still calling, she realized. It had never stopped. Maybe it was time to answer. Walking through the terminal toward ground transportation, Kestrel felt lighter than she had in years. Not because the weight was gone. She'd learned that some burdens never fully disappear, but because she'd remembered what the weight was for. To keep other people aloft. To ensure that when the impossible happened, someone would be ready with the skill and courage to make it possible again. Her phone buzzed with text messages, probably her sister, wondering about her flight status. But there would be time for explanations later. Right now, she wanted to sit in the terminal's observation area and watch the airport work. The ground crews marshaling aircraft, the control tower coordinating traffic, the endless dance of departure and arrival that connected this small mountain city to the wider world. She found a seat with a view of the runway and watched an F-16 take off into the darkness, its afterburner cutting through the snow like a blue-white sword. The pilot was probably young, probably eager, probably convinced that they were invincible in the way that only 20-something fighter pilots could be. She'd been that pilot once. Before the missions that didn't make the news, before the losses that did, before the gradual realization that perfection wasn't sustainable, and that even the best pilots were still just human beings strapped to very fast machines. But watching that F-16 disappear into the mountain darkness, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years. Pride. Not in herself, necessarily, but in the continuity of it all. The passing of skills from one generation to the next, the endless cycle of training and service that ensured someone would always be ready when the impossible became inevitable. Her call sign had been Phoenix for good reason. She'd risen from the ashes of destroyed aircraft, failed missions, and personal loss more times than she could count. Tonight, she'd done it again, not from physical wreckage, but from the emotional debris of a career she'd walked away from when the pressure became too much to bear. Maybe that was the real lesson. Not that you had to stay in the fight forever, but that you had to be ready when the fight came looking for you. Even if you were dozing in 7C, trying to forget you'd ever been meant to fly. The observation area was nearly empty now. Just a few family members waiting for late arrivals and a janitor methodically working his way between the rows of chairs. The coffee shop was closing, its employees wiping down counters and turning off espresso machines. But the runway stayed busy. Aircraft coming and going, their navigation lights creating brief constellations against the dark sky. Pilots she'd never meet, facing challenges she'd never know about, all of them connected by the thin threads of radio communication and shared professional competence. It was a good system, she thought. Not perfect, no human system ever was, but good. Built on layers of redundancy and training, designed to function even when individual components failed, even when captains collapsed and backup pilots had to be recruited from passenger seats. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she didn't recognize, probably a journalist who'd already tracked down her identity and contact information. The modern world didn't allow for much privacy, especially when your emergency landing got captured on dozens of passenger phones and uploaded to social media within minutes. But she wasn't ready for those conversations yet. Tonight was for processing what had happened, for understanding what it meant to feel useful again after 5 years of voluntary exile from the profession that had defined her adult life. Tomorrow, she'd figure out what came next, whether this was a one-time resurrection or the beginning of something larger, whether Phoenix was just a call sign from her past or a promise about her future. Either way, she knew one thing with certainty. She was a pilot again, not because of any official paperwork or organizational assignment, but because she'd done what pilots do when civilians needed saving. She'd flown the aircraft home. Outside the terminal windows, another F-16 was taxiing for takeoff, its pilot probably running through the same pre-flight checks she'd performed thousands of times in her military career. The same systematic verification that every system was ready, every parameter was within limits, every possible contingency had been considered and prepared for. It was a beautiful process, she realized. Not just the flying itself, but the preparation for it. The endless training that made emergency responses feel routine, the constant practice that turned complex procedures into muscle memory. She'd missed that more than she'd admitted to herself. The precision, the teamwork, the absolute clarity that came from knowing exactly what your job was and exactly how to do it well. Civilian life had its rewards: privacy, predictability, the luxury of making mistakes that didn't endanger other people. But it had never offered the satisfaction of being exactly where you needed to be when everything depended on your competence. The young F-16 pilot was probably thinking about the mission ahead, running through procedures and contingencies with the focused intensity that had once defined her own approach to flying. That pilot might someday face their own impossible situation, their own moment when training would be the only thing standing between success and disaster. When that moment came, they'd be ready. Because the system worked, imperfect as it was. Because someone had trained them and someone had trained their trainers in an unbroken chain of competence stretching back to the first military aviators who'd figured out how to turn mechanical flight into something more than an interesting experiment. She'd been part of that chain once. Tonight, she'd been part of it again. And maybe, if she was honest with herself, she'd never really stopped being part of it. Maybe you couldn't resign from being the person you were trained to be, couldn't walk away from skills that had been burned into your neural pathways through repetition and consequence. Maybe Phoenix wasn't just her call sign. Maybe it was her promise to the world that some things were too important to stay buried, no matter how much easier it might be to let them rest. The terminal was quieting now. Most of the evening's passengers processed through security or collected by friends and family. But the control tower stayed busy, its controllers managing the complex choreography of aircraft movements with voices that carried across radio frequencies to cockpits scattered throughout the region. Kestrel listened to the distant murmur of those communications and felt something settling into place inside her chest. A recognition, maybe, or a remembering of who she'd been before the weight of perfection had become too much to carry. She was still that person, she realized. The uniform was gone, the military structure was gone, but the pilot remained. The woman who could calculate approach angles and crosswind corrections by instinct, who could read weather patterns and aircraft behavior like text on a page. That woman had never really left. She'd just been waiting in seat 7C for someone to ask the right question. And now that the question had been asked and answered, there was no going back to pretending she was just another civilian passenger. She was Phoenix, she was a pilot, and the sky, it seemed, was ready to welcome her home.